Hi everyone, so in this video we're going to talk about framing. This is going to be a general introduction to what framing is and some examples of the ways in which you can frame debates. Hopefully this is mainly aimed at individuals who maybe don't know what framing is, or at least don't utilize framing as much in debating. So first off, probably useful to explain what this workshop will be about so you can find out if it's going to be useful before you just watch it, I suppose. If you find that you're regularly happening to be in debates, irrespective of power matching, so irrespective of how you're doing in earlier rounds, and you find yourself in off-bait debates where judges often claim it's very, very close, and that sometimes you feel hard done because you end up losing clashes, you end up losing comparisons between teams on very, very minor things, like whether something was more proven than something else, or something that's generally not unappetizing, let's say. Or if you find that you end up in debates one after another where you feel as if you're just running the same argument over and over again, this is probably an indication that you're not utilizing framing at all, because each debate has a unique capacity to contextualize it, but also to strategically reposition the strengths of certain arguments in ways that we'll talk about. And if you also find that you end up, when you're against stronger teams, independent of the fact that you may have strong case generation, analysis, and rebuttal capacities, you find it's quite hard to beat them, and you feel a little bit stuck. This is probably going to be a workshop where you're going to learn at least a different weapon that you can use in debating to hopefully some success. So if those things apply to you, then this workshop may be helpful to you. So we're going to talk about, firstly, obviously we're going to talk about what framing is. I'm going to give you some examples of types of frames, and then I'm going to give how you may utilize framing differently depending if you're in opening positions or closing positions, and then we'll just naturally summarize what we're talking about. So what is framing? I think, broadly speaking, as in, there are two ways to explain framing. The first is a meta-level explanation, the second is just an actual. So let's talk about the actual. This is just where you're contextualizing what is happening in a debate, and you're explaining the ways in which you think judges should or shouldn't credit certain arguments. In a meta sense, what framing is doing is you're trying to make your opponent's life that much more harder by trying to push them off kilter, by trying to frame the debate in ways that you think they haven't expected, in the ways in which they haven't preempted for. And essentially this just is an exercise in reducing the amount of effort you have to put into getting a first. So considering just what is framing, right? So contextualization. So you may have a motion that may seem abstract or may actually take place in the world. Framing can just be simply and honestly describing what this looks like in the world. So if you have a motion about Taiwan and China, for instance, framing could just simply be explaining what is happening in Taiwan, what is happening in China at the moment, and honestly describing the relationship between China and Taiwan. This is only going to get you so far. So this is good in opening government, especially if you're Prime Minister. It helps to set up a debate. It helps for you to describe what is happening so everyone is on the same peg, on the same level, especially if they don't have knowledge themselves. So you just make the debate cleaner and honestly can make the debate more enjoyable to listen to. But strategically, framing has a much higher purpose. So what framing does is that you are not necessarily wanting to give an honest depiction of the world, but you want to give a very specific depiction of the world that you think is advantageous to your side of the debate. So this may be pushing context-specific importances. So if you're talking about China or Taiwan, if you're trying to make arguments about the weaknesses of China, you may choose to contextualize the Taiwanese-Chinese relationship based on all the things that are currently going wrong with China, for instance. So when this video is being made, China is struggling to recover from their zero-COVID strategy. Xi Jinping is persistently trying to undermine his opponents in a very public manner, and generally public appeal towards China is drastically reduced. There's my, oh god, I've hurt my social credit score now, wonderful. So that may be something that you may wish to use as a framing device in order to already push argumentation about the undermining of China. What this can also do as framing is to narrow the debate in a way that isn't a squirrel, right? So what a squirrel is where you try to claim a debate is something that it isn't. That is unfair, but narrowing the debate is actually something that you, especially if you find you're often losing an opening government, which, you know, we all lose an opening government sometimes, is a strategic necessity. So for instance, you can have debates that are incredibly broad, like econ debates are one example, but also IR debates are another example, where there's 10, 11 different moving cogs that exist. within it, like how one group interacts with another, but there are 10 different groups interacting, or there are 10 different circumstances and 10 different actors or whatever. What framing does is you can explain why a part of that moving system is important by simply just talking about it. So this can look like starting your PM speech by just purely characterizing what is happening to two actors in particular, as a way of trying to explain why the judges should only really care about what is happening in this specific instance. If you do framing successfully, and hopefully by the end of this workshop you will know how to do this successfully, this can cut a lot of parts of the debate out, so you don't have to spend your 14 minutes of OG desperately trying to analyze every single argument, or desperately trying to outweigh every different type of actor. So for instance, in the Taiwan-China example, let's choose an example a bit broader. So let's say you have a general debate about ASEAN, for instance, which is like a kind of an economic pseudo-union between Eastern Asian states. There are a lot of moving cogs here, and you may wish to describe one particular interaction between two particular types of countries in order to narrow the focus of the debate. Even just in articulating this, you already push in the judge's mind that this is something that is uniquely important per the fact you're talking about it. But in the ways in which you talk about it, as we'll find later, can make already persuasive devices in terms of vulnerability weighing. The fourth thing this does, generally, is it minimizes the importance of other arguments. So rather than doing very specific line-by-line preemption, particularly if you're Prime Minister, like explaining why argument A, B, or C aren't going to be explicitly persuasive from op, which can be very rhetorically persuasive in some instances, but in others, when there's so many different arguments that can be run, is usually a waste of your time. What framing can do, though, is already implicitly undermine the validity of those arguments, or undermine the persuasive power of those arguments. So for instance, you could claim, if we're talking about something to do with the European Union, for instance, like for some reason the migrant crisis is on my mind right now because of Rishi, you could explain an aspect of the government's response to migration in a way that undermines the obvious importance of other aspects, in ways we'll describe in a second. So essentially, framing can contextualize, it can push specific importances by virtue of just talking about specific contexts, it can ground the debate in fair or slightly unfair grounding, i.e. making sure everyone in the debate knows what we're talking about, particularly if it's a spec-heavy motion. And it can be the first step, and quite a persuasive step, in preemption of opponent's argumentation. Let's talk about types of frames, right? So framing in itself just changes the landscape of the comparative, i.e. when teams are in prep and when they've seen the motion, often, hopefully, motions will have balance in the sense that there are equally as persuasive arguments on a government side and an opposition side. What framing does as a device in debating is it changes the comparative in the sense of how easy it is to access each argument. So if a frame from opening government is successful, it is successful because it will make it harder for op to make arguments that the CAs believed them to be easily made. This isn't to say that framing is a be-all and end-all strategy of winning, i.e. just because you frame one thing you probably won, but you'll be surprised by how many times people, particularly your opponents, will just not engage with your frame, and it can be a very, very easy way to get on a very good start in the debate. Particularly if you're opening government, I think framing is what becomes essential to doing well in a debate. We'll talk about some examples and hopefully elucidate the argument further. Let's look at the first type of, I'm going to break this down into a number of categories. So the first category of framing is marginalisation. So this type of frame is when you are taking a debate that has multiple different maybe trade-offs or multiple different clashes, and you're trying to use your frame to explain one specific clash and why it is important. This will be elucidated further in a minute. The second is focusing. So sometimes there are multiple different trade-offs in a debate. Each to you can seem equally as persuasive, but you could hone the debate in on a particular type of trade-off and a particular type of issue in a way that means that teams will have to engage with that particular type of trade-off. So often framing, particularly in Prime Minister, can be essential in making your opponents move towards a particular clash as opposed to another. So focusing as a form of framing can be vitally important in motions that are unbalanced. So motions where it is just easier for Gov or easier for Op to make certain arguments, In these instances, focus framing is essential in order for you to have some chance of survival in this room. So for instance, you may have motions like, this House believes that governments should abandon the policy of decapitation, where decapitation anti-terrorism is where you go for the leader of a terrorist organization. This is a op-weighted motion because it's quite easy to understand, one, why there are other anti-terrorism mechanisms that lock governments out of principal argumentation about why anti-terrorism is bad. And it just seems very intuitive that attacking the leader that has all of the information and all of the know-how of a terrorist organization seems to be a generally good idea. So focusing in this instance, a government could focus by using a frame on why there is this particular part of decapitation as a method that is really bad. For instance, they could focus that leaders are not necessarily the be-all and end-all of the access of information. What you should actually be more concerned about is this really specific idea of recruitment, right? So this frame would be describing why recruitment is the be-all and end-all and potentially the worst harm that comes from terrorism, i.e. it is the cause of terrorism, it is the promulgation of terrorism, it is the thing that doesn't change by the motion. In actual fact, decapitations for some reason makes it worse. You have to come up with those reasons for yourself. So focusing can be positioning the debate. The analogy here would be you have a massive Da Vinci painting and you choose as a prime minister or a leader of opposition or extension speaker to tell the judges and try to push the other speakers into just focusing on a corner of that image, the corner of the image that you think is easiest for you to describe that is beautiful, easiest for you to tell that you're doing better in. It's kind of esoteric the way I'm describing this, but it'll become clear in a second. The third type of frame is a preemptive frame. So a preemption as a strategy is trying to, in prep, understand that your opponents in your closing may try to argue certain things. And rather than arguing for them yourself, within this with preemptive framing, you can undermine the importance of this type of argument or undermine the attention that teams bring to this argument per your focusing or per your preemption on why other aspects are important. For example, you could have a debate, for instance, about like economic management. So maybe something like, this house regrets the trend. This house regrets the long-term trend in central banks having like really low interest rates. The preemptive framing could be like, okay, Op is probably going to argue that low interest rates were really good because they helped people get cheap debt, and this helped them get houses and shit. The preemptive framing from opening government here might be to say, so opposition may make the argument I just talked about. However, this is not particularly important in this debate because, one, the access to cheap debt is something that is bad, or the thing that is really important in this debate is the ways in which government physical policy have changed as a result. Framing here is a device that can focus your attention, but also the judge's attention, on certain other important moving aspects of the debate. The fourth type of framing here is vulnerability framing. This is where you are trying to... Framing in a lot of instances is like 1-part analysis, 3-part rhetoric. And this is why I do think rhetoric does actually matter in debating, and framing is a key example of where rhetoric does matter. So vulnerability framing would be to frame a certain type of actor is uniquely vulnerable, and therefore uniquely something that we should concern ourselves with in debating. The framing comes by the characterization of why this person is vulnerable. Compare these two ways of saying this, right? Let's say one team tells you, minorities are very vulnerable in status quo because they lack recourse mechanisms. Great, right? That seems okay. Then compare this to this way of saying it. Minorities are persistently accosted in status quo by police officers. They are brutalized. They are marginalized from the justice system in an extent that they won't even go up to the justice system to seek retribution. This is a principal maladaptation of their inherent right to freedom and their inherent right to justice. Both of these things are essentially, both of those examples are essentially arguing the same thing. The first is just cold-hearted analysis. The second is some vulnerability framing. By characterizing why something that is vulnerable is important through the framing, I have actually added something to the analysis and probably made it nicer to listen to. This can be very important when you're closing, when you may not have very good judges, or judges that are just tired, or judges that actually just are willing to buy into framing, because I do think framing can make something more persuasive. that we'll talk about in a second. So that's an example of vulnerability weighing, i.e. characterizing not just why X is vulnerable, but what being vulnerable actually means in a way that judges can understand why that isn't something important. Next is contextualization. So this is very, very useful in IR debates, or just debates about very human topics. So things like relationship motions are very good for contextualization, but basically anything actually, the more you think about it. So contextualization is just like, we're talking about a motion in a room, but this motion is actually probably would affect something in the real world. So let's ground this debate in the real world and let's show how it plays out in the real world. This can be a very good way of doing a few things. One, of grounding the debate in seriousness. I think it's quite important that if you're wanting to do well in debating, obviously to take it seriously, but a part of taking it seriously is to understand that you're not just trying to beat a team, but you're actually talking about something that is actually important in the world. This is just a way of engaging yourself in the game, but also making the debate more enjoyable, because teams have become less flippant and usually less ad hominem if you make the debate something that actually matters. So this could be describing current status news. This is where it's probably important to keep abreast with the news. So for instance, if you have a motion about, like, this house supports the establishment of the independent state of Kurdistan, you can have a very theoretical and abstract debate on what that means, but if you contextualize the suffering of Kurdish people throughout history and the necessity of a state, this type of framing can add massively to the persuasiveness of the claims that could just be principle, i.e. people who don't have a state should have a state of their own is an argument, but adding framing about why that is important based on the decades and millennia probably of Kurdish oppression is probably more persuasive. Recognize debating isn't just a game about analysis, it is a game about persuasion, and framing is one skill that you need to learn, and one skill that I think is very fun to employ and can be very interesting to respond to. The last is differentiation. So framing is usually extraordinarily crucial in a member's speech. So if you're a member of government, a member of opposition, i.e. the third speaker on either bench, framing is usually an essential way to lighten your load when you're trying to explain why your side can beat your opening and top half. Oftentimes, and hopefully quite regularly, you will get into rooms that actually test you. So if the competition is working correctly and you're being judged correctly, there should be no point in a competition where you don't feel a bit of strain. You don't feel as if some of your opponents are very good. You should always get into that stage, probably round 3, where your opponents are actually pretty strong, and you're having to really think hard about a debate. This is where, in closing, differentiation can work. So differentiation is a very meta kind of strategy. So this is explaining, one, what has happened in your top half, and then trying to reposition the debate in something that you think is an easier ground to win. So this differentiation can just be just taking a cog that opening government thinks is important and just claiming that the other cog is important by using the same type of framing they could have used in opening but in closing anyway. And also just a meta level of description. It can make it very easy for the judges to know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and get some quite far into why it does matter that you're talking about something different. We'll talk about this in a second. So these are the 6 different ideas that I think can be subclassed as framing. When we see them, hopefully they'll be elucidated a bit further. So let's talk about framing examples. So let's talk about an example of marginalisation. So if you have the debate like this House would support separatist movements in the European Union, here are 2 examples of types of frames that could exist in the category of marginalisation. So a marginalisation framing is essentially trying to push aspects of the debate out from view, as in you don't want to argue to them because you obviously only have 7 minutes, and you want to position the case you're going to make to try to push the other stuff aside, so that stuff that you're talking about is actually important. Here's one example you might use on Gov. You might argue, okay, separatist movements are only affecting rich nations in the European Union. What this is doing is you're trying to narrow the debate into a specific type of separatism. So this is probably separatism of Catalan, for instance. Why you're doing this is you're trying to start to insulate your argumentation against maybe examples you don't know, right? There are separatist movements that exist throughout the Baltic regions and poorer regions of the European Union. But you can use marginalisation framing to position the debate in a way that you think is advantageous to you. Perhaps you just think you have better argumentation, or you feel more confident making argumentation about the richer nations or separatist movements like the Catalan independence movement that you may know about. Marginalisation as a frame can be a very important way to signal to judges what you're talking about and to signal to other teams what you want them to talk about. Often, obviously, before I go on, if you're an opponent to this frame, you don't just agree with the frame, you can counter frame, but that's a bit more complicated, but just treating this as an individual exercise. A second example is you could say, actually, separatist movements are influenced, that separatist influence is actually something that is structurally limited. So when we're talking about this motion, the separatists can't do that much to the European Union because there is power asymmetry. So what we're actually talking about is an evaluating a principle of whether or not separatism is good or bad. This is a form of meta-marginalization, right? You're not trying to marginalize the impact of the debate, as in where the debate takes place. I want to be very clear that there's a distinction between place setting and what we're doing. Place setting is bad, right? You can't, as open government, say this debate only takes place in Catalan. But you can use framing to explain what the judges should only really care about when this debate takes place in Catalan. I.e., you can say separatist movement in the left-hand argument, the left-hand frame about richer nations. That separatist movements are uniquely more impactful in richer nations, i.e. they have more money to do shit, more people are bought into the system and the nation, right? This isn't a very persuasive frame, hopefully you'll realize why. But this is something that you should do and can do in order to ground the persuasion of the arguments. The second is the meta claim, right? You may be like trying to move this debate beyond consequences because maybe you just don't want to engage in the consequential clash of this debate. You don't want to go back and forth about whether separatist movements are powerful enough to care about them or aren't powerful enough not to care about them, etc., etc. You may wish to claim that, okay, all of this is up in the air. Every person has an argument about this. Every side is probably equally right. So we're talking about the principle here. This framing can be important to just signal to judges what you're doing, because judges are honestly trying to understand what you're talking about, and like 8/10 of the time, or 4/5, I could do fractions, 4/5 of the time, the reason teams may not do very well in a debate is just the judges have no fucking idea what you're talking about and why you're talking about it. Framing in this instance can be a very good way for judges just to know what you're talking about. I think there's a distinction between signposting and framing here. Signposting is just literally going, I'm going to talk about one, this argument, two, the second argument. What framing is not just signposting, but already starting to add to your argument about why what you're going to talk about is important. I think this is a better way to signpost in my opinion. So this is an example of marginalization. So the left is kind of place setting, but place setting based on importance and analysis. And the second type is like meta marginalization. So what you should want to talk, what teams should be debating about in the debate. Second is an example is focusing. So let's say we have the same motion. You may wish to focus the debate in certain areas that you find strategic. So for instance, you may argue that Catalan separatism movements are the biggest delta in the debate. So now you're framing that, okay, there may exist all other separatist movements, but the separatist movements you should care about are this particular type of separatist movement in the European Union. I hope you can appreciate the strategic advantage of this, because then you can just start talking about the specifics that you know about Catalan separatism, if you do know them, in a very analytically rigorous way, hopefully, not just matter dumping. The strategic utility of this is, one, I imagine your opposition probably don't want you to do this or haven't thought that you're going to do this. It can tip them off, as in it can just like go, oh shit, I have to think about this in a different way. And some teams may just follow your framing because it's very messy. Although do be prepared that if you make frames this specific, things are going to get messy. This can be a way of marginalizing and focusing the debate into something that you're very important, that you think is strategic for you. Whether or not this is strategic, I have no idea, because I haven't thought about it. It's hard, but it could be. Another idea could just be in the inverse by saying, actually, a different separatist movement is important. Turkish Cypriots are most important because Turkey's influence in the future influence in the European Union is something that the European Union should care about most. You can see these are two potentially persuasive frames, and these can be both uniquely advantageous and disadvantageous depending on what you think the debate is going to evolve into. In this case, you choose either based on how confident you feel about this, or whether you want to go I know more about Spain, or having a founder member of the European Union separatist movement is more interesting or more useful for me, or in a developing part of the European Union, etc. What I'm trying to exemplify here is, just because a debate may be broad, you can narrow the debate down and focus it into areas that you think are going to be very useful to you, and maybe ones in which you have spent 50 minutes of prep talking about, and you don't think your opponents are going to specifically talk about this. Great. Let's talk about preemptive, right? So here's two examples of preemptive framing. You may argue, firstly, that the absence of support means that separatists do worse harms. So you probably know that opposition may argue that you shouldn't support separatist movements because if you do support them, they undermine the European Union in a really crucial way. You can preemptively frame this argument out of the debate by arguing that actually the absence of support makes that separatists do worse harms. This is framing because you're trying to burden push to government opposition here. You're not letting opposition go without any effort. You're already preemptively pushing onto them and reminding the judges that they do have to prove a comparative change. Another example here is that actually separatists are bad for X and support for X makes worse. So this is two competing frames, right? The framing of preemption here, and how it's distinct from analysis, is that the frame is trying to, when you say this, you will start explaining why this is the case. The frame is like basically a claim in this instance, but a context-specific claim. So this can be a good way of starting out the preemption and to signal to judges that you're going to be preemptive against these arguments. Talk about vulnerability here, which is probably the kind of frame that I think, at least I use most, I think is rhetorically most persuasive and usually most fun to use. You may argue one, that as a point of framing, the European Union has certain fundamental principles, and to not support separatist movement would be to undermine these principles. What you're doing here is you're framing that what you should care about in the debate is the vulnerability of the actor rather than other aspects of the actor. This seems implicit, but if you read the judge scale, judges aren't just meant to track explicit claims, they are also meant to track implicit claims. And I don't undermine the capacity of judges to follow implicit claims, because I think framing makes you talk like a human, if that makes sense, rather than just a debater, and actually can be quite persuasive. It's also important to recognize that teams will do this, and you need to also recognize when teams aren't doing these types of framing so that you can actually respond to them properly. Second example is maybe separatism is linked to economic deprivation of the majority. So for instance, if Catalan became independent and took Barcelona with them, or whatever, I think there's a rich region of Spain that would be taken. This may undermine the economic integrity of other Spanish regions and may therefore undermine their capacity to consent into the European Union, for instance. These are two pieces of vulnerability framing about what is important and why it is important. Both of these are implicit, but both of these are ways in which you can frame parts of what your arguments should be talking about. Next is contextualization. So this is probably, especially in IR motions and even in this motion, or just generally any bloody motion, necessary. This is not spec knowledge, and even if it is still good. Spec knowledges won't win you debates, but spec knowledge can massively enhance the clarity of what you're saying and massively enhance the persuasiveness of an argument. See the earlier example I made about like explaining the vulnerability of police brutality by framing as opposed to just pure cold-hearted analysis. By framing becomes far more persuasive if you're contextualizing it as opposed to just pure cold-hearted analysis. So let's take a look at examples here. Your first contextualization that you may want to use in Prime Minister is that the reason separatist movements should be supported now is because there was a massive amount of anti-independence reformations in the 1970s. This alienated Catalan political leaders from democratic participation. This is a subtype of framing called urgency framing. So this is where you're trying to say the reason we should do this motion is not just principally because it's good, but because there is something urgent or something unsolved that this motion needs to solve, and this is the piece of framing panel that persuades you that it ought to be done. The reason I think this works is you can just say in debating, oh, actor X has no democratic rights and therefore has no recourse. This is fine, right? But you wouldn't believe it. But the amount of times in which contextualization, or at least even if you're bullshitting, this bullshitting types of contextualization is just inherently more persuasive to a human being and a judge, right? If you claim as if you know what you're talking about and articulate it as if you do know what you're talking about, and you just use this piece of spec knowledge, I actually do think this is more persuasive. And there'll be some judges who won't believe me, but judging is ultimately subjective. I do think this is more persuasive, and framing is always important here. So if you do know what's going on in the topic, or you do know something about the topic, frame it to your advantage. If nothing else, because it'll scare your opponents, and they'll think, oh shit, I don't want to just go up and tell that guy he's wrong, because he probably doesn't know something about it. And humans don't want to look like idiots. Second piece of framing that would be counter to this is actually there's a massive amount of backlash of the 1970s Spanish reforms that actually ended up creating autonomous zones, particularly within even Catalan, that created some form of representation. These are counter frames of technically spec knowledge, but they're counter contextualization frames. if I only have this frame, so if I only have Spanish reforms, this Spanish reforms framing without pointing this out, or at least arguing this is very persuasive to why there is a problem that separatist movements need to solve. Obviously, it doesn't solve the motion, as in it doesn't prove that EUs should do this, or would support this, or the House would support this in the European Union, but it does goes a hell of a long way to arguing why there's a moral duty for you to do so. And this, on the other hand, and then if you have the opposition one about reformation zones, this undermines the persuasiveness of not just this argument, but also just very cold-hearted analysis about democratic reformation, right? Imagine all teams in this debate, even if they don't know anything about this motion, would argue that separatist movements may be a generally good thing because separatism is formed from not thinking that you're represented in the state. And then if you're like, hang on guys, there's a lot of, you know, if you're talking about Catalan, there's a lot of efforts of autonomous representation in these areas. This mitigates and marginalizes the severity of the vulnerability, right? This marginalizes whether this is a really urgent, important thing to do and whether or not there's alternative ways of doing it. So this is an example of contextualization. I think this is the most fun part of debating, especially in IR. I quite enjoy IR and econ for this reason, is that you can actually just use stuff you know rather than just running the same damn stock analysis over and over again, which gets a bit boring after a while. Finally, differentiation. So differentiation is just meta debating. That I'll talk about in a second. Differentiation is like when you're in closing, trying to use one of those 4-5 tactics in a way that you explain why it needs to be changed. So for instance, opening may have talked about one specific vulnerability frame about a particular actor. Your differentiation framing may be like, okay, I'm going to talk about this different vulnerability actor, and this is why I need to shift the debate in this way. And you can insert bullshit reason here, as in, oh, we don't know if actually there's a change in that person, or actually this person is more vulnerable. But this framing is a contextualization of what you're trying to do in the debate. So rather than contextualizing the world, it's also important to contextualize, especially as the debate evolves on, what you're doing and why you're doing it. The reason for this is, it may seem obvious to you what you need to do in a debate. Judges may have different intuitions. Some judges may not be fucking listening. So you can use framing to justify to the judge why you're necessary to listen to. And if you do this, I think Alexander's judging video is very good. Alexander's extension video, rather, is very good at explaining why this is true and good. So let's talk a little bit about meta weighing. And I'm going to differentiate this into opening and closing. So if you talk about opening, I do think you can use that form of weighing in a number of ways. So all of the 6 forms of weighing can just be used to set up a debate. So one of Prime Minister's roles is just to, and a leader of opposition for that matter, is to not just advance argumentation, but to set up the trade-offs of a debate. You don't want to just stand up and be honest. Like, this might sound disingenuous. It's not it is disingenuous. If you want to win a debate, you don't just stand up and say the honest trade-offs of the debate. What you want to do is you want to stand up and use framing to describe what the trade-offs are, but to select how you talk about trade-offs and what trade-offs you talk about to those that are just easiest for you to win. The reason you want to do this is, obviously you want to give your opponents the benefit of the doubt, and you want to give your opponents as much as possible just to be nice, but not every person, like, even the best debater isn't the best debater, if that makes sense. As in, whilst it would be nice to treat your opponents generously, there are some instances where you want to win, and this is a competitive sport, right? You want to get that first, you want to get that 3 points. Framing is a way in which you can make it yourself easy, make it easier for your team to take the first by shifting burdens. So in opening, you can use this framing to, as we talked about, get rid of certain clashes, well, not clashes per se, but undermine the amount of time some teams talk about some clashes, which means they underdevelop analysis for that clashes, or just marginalize the importance of certain clashes, as in disagreements that exist in the debate, or undermine certain other arguments or other types of contextualization. This is where you want to be thinking about in prep, right? And this will come with experience. This is not something that you can easily do. And I do think the more times you do debate, the more debates you do, the more this becomes apparent and obvious to you. But framing can be a very good way in which you can undermine your opponents and undermine the closing teams. It can make harder for closing teams to come into the debate and say, oh, my top half missed X. You're like, yeah, bro, I missed X, but I explained why I didn't want to talk about X. And that's what framing essentially is. Closing is a little bit different, right? So closing is where you can use differentiation to reposition a debate. So sometimes, whilst it may be true that, as I said flippantly earlier, opening teams may frame the debate in a certain way, oftentimes opening teams don't frame at all. Sometimes they just run three pieces of analysis or three impacts. They may weigh this impact as like, this impact is the most important because it affects the most vulnerable actor. You're like, cool, bro. Then you're closing. An easy way to enhance the persuasiveness is just to describe the world that exists and describe why certain trade-offs are more worthy than not. Framing is a way inherently for you to describe this. So for instance, if you're an extension speaker, you wish to track top half and see active listening if you think that's your weakness. Think about what the teams on top half are disagreeing about, and then think of loads of reasons why you think, even if opening opposition are correct, if you're closing government here, if opening opposition have said argument X, Y, Z, try to just say, yeah, X, Y, and Z are probably true, but let's think about why they're not important. This is where you can frame out teams. So the way to do this is you can use things like mitigation by saying the things they're talking about, as in like this particular actor is affected in this way, are true, but this isn't that important because of this real world context, or because of this set of reasons that mean that that actor isn't as important as our actor. This is also something we call weighing, but framing is a way of describing why this is true, at least in a way that can be rhetorical. This can count as a response as well, and this is why we realize in debating the word framing, weighing, and rebuttal can mean the same fucking thing. But this is just what we're talking about here. So this can undermine the persuasiveness and plausibility of your opening claims, and it can also just undermine or even decimate if there is a change that exists. So what all teams are doing in debating is you've got 4 teams that are arguing for 40 minutes why something changes in an emotion, and framing can be a way to undermine or even destroy the fact that tipping point exists. I.e., you may frame a real-world context that gives the judges reason to believe that there are other factors, for instance, that restrains what we're talking about. So, for instance, in the motion about supporting Catalan independence, opening government may argue we should support Catalan independence, or this House would support it because if this House supported the European Union, movements would become separatist movements would be successful. You mean closing opposition could just frame like in the real world. There are so many political realities where separatism is restricted. They have too little power. This House isn't going to be able to give them power. Support doesn't give them power a priori. Here are all the reasons why it's not going to change anything. And this is a way of out-framing top half, as in this is a type of rebuttal, but this is just a way of exemplifying why they're probably not right. So there's an example. So in opening, you can frame to give yourself an easier time. And in closing, you can frame to also give yourself an easier time by beating some of the teams that exist on top half. Let's talk about some more specific examples, because I'm being a little bit esoteric. So let's say we have one motion. So let's say we have this House would allow parents to sue their adult children for financial support. You may have an opening government claim, that is, children take disproportionate money for development, parents are usually poor and suffer as a result, ergo, parents, if they're not getting money from children, should be allowed to get money from children. Kind of a principal claim here, but maybe a consequential claim on why they need the money to have a good life. How we're going to outframe this now. So you might want to think of some other examples than the ones I've given. But you might want to use a focusing frame, right? You might be like, actually, emotional support matters more than money. And that's your first frame, right? You describe why this is true by saying maybe emotionality is far more intrinsic to your self-affection than money is. I had a weird intuition, I'm not going to repeat it, but I remember I said an intuition, like, you'd rather spend time with your family and starve rather than have cake and be alone. I won that debate, but I don't think that's the reason why I won that debate. Anyway, or you might try to use marginalisation, right? You might be like, okay, this argument for an opening government is probably true, but probably doesn't exist in every context of the world. So you might be arguing poorer nations, there probably exists like a lot of there may exist more communalism, as in a stronger social intergenerational connections. And therefore this debate probably that change about whether parents are poor because of their giving their money to their children who are now rich probably only applies to richer countries. And within these countries, material deprivation isn't a problem because you have like social security nets and stuff. This is technically analysis, but it is actually more framing. The reason this is framing is because you're contextualizing how this argument has a real world implication in different instances, and then within probably in that 1 to 2 sentences, the judges already probably have undermined the persuasiveness of that claim by you contextualizing and indeed marginalizing by contextualizing why that argument probably isn't that persuasive. You probably follow this up with a lot of other reasons of why it's not true, and why even if it is true, but even if analysis is a different video. So hopefully that gives you an example of what focusing and marginalization can mean in this debate, and hopefully grounds a bit more of what I've been talking about. The second example here is this house, as the West would cut ties with Myanmar until Suu Kyi is restored into power. So opening opposition's arguments may be Suu restoration is good, but diplomatic ties are necessary. I.e. they argue, okay, the metric of this debate is probably some degree of Myanmar stability that comes from having, you know, people liking each other and the military not killing people. But Gov might argue, well, you need diplomatic ties, and therefore you don't want to cut ties with them. How do you outframe this on Gov? Maybe a few ways to do this, right? You might contextualize what is happening in Myanmar, as in you have a military regime, and that they are resilient to Western-style diplomacy by virtue of the fact that a lot of their military aid and military weapons come from China, and therefore they already have alternatives to who they can support. This is a way of outframing this, right? Because you're like, even if it's true that opening opposition says diplomatic ties are necessary, it's not probably true they are as necessary as you talk about, because the West doesn't have the capacity. Obviously, this is only the start point, right? But the power of framing is the judges already know what you're talking about, they already know why you're talking about it, and they're already some way along believing you, per just a sentence, right? And this can help just, in your mind, understand what you're talking about, but also understand in the teams what they're arguing for. This is also preemptive, right? This preempts any type, this already has started the preemption about why diplomatic ties are bad, are not going to be effective, even if for some reason they are good. So framing is very powerful here in this way. So thinking about these 7 things, 6, I can't remember the number now. God, I did this with the econ one. Anyway, 6 times, yeah, 6. You can start using these 6 buzzwords like focusing and marginalization to ask yourself questions about arguments in ways that provoke this type of framing. Great. So, a little esoteric, but framing in its very basic sense is just a necessary persuasive tool to shift a debate in your favor. Debates are often balanced or maybe slightly not balanced, but framing allows you to just either correct the imbalance or push the advantage. You always want to use framing in a certain extent anywhere. It doesn't matter if you're Prime Minister, Whip, Member, Deputy. Framing is a very powerful persuasive tool for you to ground why judges should care about your arguments, but also to undermine the validity of other people's arguments without having to go into the really nitty-gritty of why the analysis is untrue. Because the further you advance in debating and the harder your opponents get, the less time you will have to do all of this nitty-gritty shit. And it's kind of annoying. Most judges miss everything, and it's not very fun. If you want fun in debating and you just want to, you know, sound nice, which some people want to sound nice, I don't know what that sounds. I don't know what that feels like, but maybe some people do. Framing can be very important here. So oftentimes, and it's important to point out, framing can sometimes be the be-all and end-all of winning a debate. You'd be surprised how many times opening government are not that analytically strong, but have a really persuasive piece of framing that marginalizes the plausibility of core op arguments, and teams just dunk on the OG without actually engaging with the framing, and then they end up winning because judges are like, well, they contextualize this debate in this instance, which makes us persuaded that this is a really important instance. So even if you're able to out-analyze them, they've already technically outweighed you. So framing is really important. So don't just create framing in like Prime Minister, but be very cautious about responding to framing. If you hear a frame, don't leave it unchallenged. You need to undermine it. I think Path in their rebuttal video is very good at pointing this out. Recognize that different types of framing exist, but all of them do require practice and confidence, right? A lot of these framing does rely on things like spec-like knowledge. Whilst that has the advantage of sounding very good and sounding very persuasive and pushing teams into engaging with you, you do need to have obviously some basic understanding of what's going on in the world and have confidence in executing it. Even if you don't, sounding as if you do is half the battle. And therefore practicing framing, reading about the news, trying this in your prep sessions, is a really, really good way to hopefully ease your burden, burden in a double sense, ease your burden to getting that first. So this is framing. Hopefully this is clear. If you've got any questions, comment sections, clarifications, I probably are in the comment section. Hope this is useful. See you around.